Leaving me alone with the housekeeper they believed couldn't speak a word of English. The moment their car disappeared down the street, she grabbed my teacup, poured it straight into the sink, then turned to me and said in flawless English, "Don't drink this. Pack your things and leave now. You're in danger." Instead of panicking, I smiled and quietly replied, "I've known you understood English since your first few days here." Her face turned completely pale. "I'm so grateful you're here with me today on Revenge, Dad. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but everything it teaches you is worth keeping. The house on Oak Hollow Lane was never meant to be lived in alone. I know that because I built it myself. Every wall, every beam, every carefully fitted joint in the hardwood floors that Margaret had picked out from a catalog in the summer of 1987. She had spread that catalog across the kitchen table of our old apartment in Glendale, jabbing her finger at a photograph of wide plank white oak and saying, "That one, Ed, that's the one we want." I had told her it was expensive. She had looked at me with those dark eyes of hers and said, "Most things worth having are." She was right, as she tended to be about most things. I finished the house in 1991. We moved in on a Tuesday in October, carrying boxes through a front door. I had hung myself slightly crooked, which Margaret never let me forget, and never once asked me to fix. 32 years, we lived there together. Raised Ryan in the back bedroom that caught the morning light. Watched the pepper trees in the garden grow tall enough to shade the whole eastern side of the yard. Built a life the way you build a house, one careful piece at a time, making sure each new thing rests solidly on what came before. Margaret died on a Thursday morning in July of 2023, in the bedroom we had shared for 3 decades, with the windows open and the sound of the neighbors' sprinklers going in the early heat. She went quietly, which was not like her at all. Margaret had opinions about everything and expressed every one of them at full volume. The quiet she left behind was the loudest thing I had ever heard. For 14 months after that, I lived in the house alone. I am not a man who complains about solitude. I had my workshop in the garage, 347 clocks in various states of repair, each one a small mechanical puzzle waiting to be understood. I had my morning coffee on the back porch. I had the pepper trees and the dry Pasadena heat, and the particular amber light that came through the kitchen windows at 4 in the afternoon. I was not happy exactly, but I was functional. I was managing. Then Ryan called. It was a Sunday evening in February, and I was in the workshop reassembling a 19th century Vienna regulator that had come to me in a cardboard box with 17 of its parts loose and one of them missing entirely. My phone buzzed on the workbench, and my son's name appeared on the screen, and I felt, I will be honest, a small involuntary warmth in my chest before I answered. Ryan and I had not spoken much since his mother's funeral, not because of any argument, simply because grief makes people either reach toward each other or pull away, and Ryan had always been a puller. "Dad," he said, and his voice had that careful quality, the over-controlled tone of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say. "Melissa and I have been talking. We're worried about you. Being out there alone in that big house, it's not right." "I'm fine, Ryan," I said, because it was mostly true. "We want to come stay with you, help out, keep you company." He paused, and I heard Melissa's voice in the background, low and deliberate. "We've already talked to my firm about working remotely. Melissa can consult from anywhere. It makes sense, Dad." They arrived on a Saturday morning in March with 2 cars loaded to the rooflines. Melissa stepped out of the passenger seat looking fresh and purposeful, her dark hair pulled back, her smile, the kind that reaches the eyes without necessarily starting there. "Edward," she said, hugging me with the precise warmth of someone who has decided to hug you. "We are going to take such good care of you." Ryan shook my hand. His grip was firm as always, but he did not quite meet my eyes, and that was new. The first week was pleasant enough on the surface, but it was the questions that stayed with me after the lights went out. On the 4th day, Melissa asked about the insurance policy on the house. On the 6th, she asked about my retirement accounts. On the 9th, she walked into my workshop, looked around at 347 clocks that had passed through Margaret's hands, and asked whether I had ever had them properly appraised. "Some of these must be worth real money," she said, her tone shifting into something softer than concern. I looked at this woman my son had married standing in the room where Margaret's fingerprints still lived on the brass and glass of things she had loved, and felt my chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I take very good care of my clocks," I said pleasantly. She smiled and went back inside. I set down the French mantel clock I had been holding and listened to Melissa's footsteps crossing the kitchen floor above me. A man who has spent 40 years diagnosing broken mechanisms learns to hear the difference between a clock that is simply running slow and one that has been deliberately set wrong. Something in this house had begun running just slightly off, and I was the only one who had noticed. Sofia Alvarez arrived on a Tuesday morning in April with a single canvas bag and a pair of dark eyes that, in my experience, understood everything they looked at. Melissa had announced the hiring 3 days earlier, over dinner, with the particular brightness she reserved for decisions she had already made and was now presenting as suggestions. "Edward, I've been thinking," she said, refilling her wine glass without being asked. "This house is a lot to manage. Ryan and I are working all day, and I don't want you to feel like the upkeep is falling on your shoulders." She reached across the table and patted my hand. Her fingers were cool and dry. "I found someone through an agency, a housekeeper. She comes very highly recommended. I've been managing this house for 30 years, I said, keeping my voice mild. "Of course you have," Melissa said warmly, as though I had said something adorable. "But you deserve help, Edward. You deserve to rest." Ryan was cutting his chicken with great concentration and did not look up, so Sophia came. She was 34 years old, compact and precise in her movements, with the kind of physical economy that belongs to people who have learned not to waste anything. Not energy, not space, not words. Melissa introduced her in the kitchen doorway, with the same tone she might use to introduce a new appliance. "Edward, this is Sophia. She doesn't speak much English, I'm afraid, but she's absolutely wonderful at what she does. We'll manage." Sophia stood with her hands folded in front of her and gave me a small, polite nod. I welcomed her in my approximate Spanish 40 years of working alongside craftsmen from Oaxaca, and Puebla had left me with a handful of phrases, none of them particularly elegant. She replied with a quiet "thank you" and looked at the floor. Melissa beamed as though she had arranged something clever. Over the following 2 weeks, I watched Sophia work. She was exceptionally good at it. The house had not been so clean since Margaret's time, and meals appeared with a quiet efficiency that would have impressed a short-order cook. But it was not her work that interested me. It was the small things that did not fit. On her third day, I was reading the Los Angeles Times at the kitchen table when I dropped a section of the paper. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, and Sophia, who was wiping down the counter with her back to me, flinched and turned toward the sound before I had said a single word. I noted that. A person who does not understand English does not orient themselves towards sudden sounds any faster than anyone else. But a person who is paying attention to everything, including the words they are pretending not to hear, develops a particular hair-trigger awareness of the environment. I had seen it before in men who worked in loud machine shops and learned to read the room without relying on sound at all. On her 7th day, I left the Times folded open to the opinion section on the kitchen table while I went to answer the door. When I came back, Sophia was wiping down the table around the newspaper, and her eyes were moving along the columns of text, not glancing, not skimming, but reading the way a person reads when they cannot help themselves. I said nothing. I sat back down and drank my coffee and thought about it. On her 12th day, Ryan told a joke at dinner, something he had heard at work, mildly funny, the kind of joke that lands better with the right delivery than with the actual content. Sophia was clearing the salad plates when the punchline arrived, and for just under 1 second, I would estimate it at no more than 800 milliseconds. The corner of her mouth pulled upward before she caught it and rearranged her face into polite blankness. She covered it by turning toward the kitchen. Ryan did not notice. Melissa did not notice. I noticed. I did not say anything then either. A man who has spent 4 decades working with mechanisms that run on tolerances measured in hundredths of a millimeter learns that the most important information is almost always in the details that seem too small to matter. I filed Sophia away in the careful mental ledger I had been keeping since March and turned my attention to the other thing that had begun to concern me: the pills. My blood pressure medication had been prescribed by Dr. Patricia Walsh at her practice in Arcadia 11 years ago. I had been on the same formulation for so long that I could have identified it in the dark small, round the specific pale blue of a clear November sky with a slight chalky texture when you press them between your fingers. I took one every morning, with breakfast had done so without interruption for over a decade. In the 3rd week of April, I picked up my pill organizer at breakfast and felt before I even opened it that something was different. The weight was fractionally off. I opened the Tuesday compartment and looked at what was inside. The pill was the right size, the right general shape, but the color was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that shouts at you, but the kind that whispers. It was a shade or two lighter than it should have been, with a slightly different sheen under the kitchen light. The texture when I pressed it was smoother. I closed the compartment. I looked up. Ryan was checking his phone. Melissa was spreading jam on her toast with focused attention. I said, I think I'll take my pill a little later today. Stomach's a bit unsettled. Of course, Melissa said, without looking up from her toast. Take your time. I went to the workshop, opened the small safe I kept behind the third shelf of the parts cabinet. The one Melissa had not yet worked out was a safe because it looked exactly like a section of shelving, and I placed the pill inside. Then I got my phone and called Dr. Patricia Walsh's office. Her nurse put me through within 10 minutes, which was one of the things I had always valued about Patricia Walsh. She was a direct woman in her early 50s who wore her gray hair short and her patients long, and she had been my doctor since a mutual friend had recommended her the year after Margaret's diagnosis. Ed, she said, what's going on? I need you to run a comparison, I said. I'm going to bring you something this afternoon. I need to know if it matches my current prescription. There was a pause on the line, brief professional. Are you telling me what I think you're telling me? I'm telling you I want a chemical analysis, I said. And Patricia, I need this to be quiet for now. No calls to the house. No messages that Ryan or Melissa might see. Another pause longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something careful and deliberate, the tone of a physician who has just understood the shape of a situation she does not like. Ed, she said slowly, if this is what I think it is, there are reporting requirements I'm obligated to follow. California law is very specific about suspected elder abuse. I can't promise you quiet indefinitely. I know the law, I said. I'm not asking you to break it. I'm asking you to wait until I've had a chance to understand exactly what I'm dealing with. A week, maybe 2. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her tapping her pen against her desk, a habit of hers, when she was thinking hard. Bring me the pill, she said finally. I'll run the analysis today. But Ed, if this comes back the way I think it might, we are going to have a serious conversation about next steps. Understood. Understood, I said. Thank you, Patricia. I drove to Arcadia that afternoon, told Ryan and Melissa I was going to the hardware store on Foothill, and was back within 2 hours. I replaced the suspicious pill with one of my actual spares. I had kept a small backup supply in the workshop safe since the first time I had noticed the color discrepancy, and sat down at my workbench to wait. The workshop was quiet around me, 347 mechanisms keeping their time without comment or complaint. All right, Margaret, I said, let's see how bad this is. The answer, as it turned out, was bad enough. The results came back on a Thursday morning, 6 days after I had driven to Arcadia, with a pill in a Ziploc bag and a suspicion I had not yet allowed myself to name out loud. Dr. Patricia Walsh called my cell phone at 8:47. I was in the workshop trying without much success to concentrate on a Seth Thomas mantle clock that needed a new suspension spring, and when I saw her name on the screen, my hands went very still on the workbench. Epo, she said, and the way she said my name carefully, the way you carry something fragile, told me everything before she said another word. I need you to come in this morning, not this afternoon, this morning. I was in her office by 10. Patricia Walsh's practice was in a low beige building on Duarte Road in Arcadia, sandwiched between a physical therapy clinic and an insurance office, the kind of thoroughly ordinary building that makes you feel somehow that everything inside it must be reliable and true. I had been coming there for 11 years. The waiting room had the same watercolor prints of California poppies on the walls that had been there when I first walked in, and the receptionist, a cheerful woman named Donna, always remembered that I took my coffee without sugar. That morning, Donna did not offer me coffee. She showed me straight back. Patricia was standing behind her desk when I came in, which she did not normally do. She was a compact woman with sharp gray eyes and the kind of posture that suggested she had made a decision and was prepared to defend it. She gestured to the chair across from her, and I sat down, and she sat down, and she placed a folder on the desk between us. The pill you brought me, she said, is not your blood pressure medication. My stomach dropped, though I had been expecting it. There is a particular kind of sick feeling that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation, from the moment when the thing you feared stops being a fear and becomes a fact. My hands tightened on the arms of the chair, and I made myself breathe evenly. What is it? I asked. It's a low-dose sedative. Patricia said, her voice flat and precise. Nothing that would show up dramatically, nothing that would put you on the floor, but taken daily over a period of weeks, it would make you tired, foggy, slow to recall things. It would make you look to a casual observer, like a man whose cognitive function was declining. She paused, and I could see the anger working in her jaw, the way it does in people who are furious but have decided that fury is not currently useful. Ed, someone replaced your blood pressure medication with a sedative. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "There's more." She opened the folder. "I also ran an analysis on the tea sample you left with Donna last week, the one you said tasted off. I had almost forgotten I had done, that had almost dismissed it as overcaution. There's a compound in it, mild. The kind of thing you might find in an over-the-counter sleep aid broken down and dissolved. Enough to take the edge off your alertness without being detectable by taste if you weren't paying close attention." The room felt very quiet. Outside the window, a truck was backing up somewhere on Duarte Road, its warning beep coming in steady mechanical pulses. "How long?" I asked. Hard to say without knowing when it started, but the effects would be cumulative. 2 months of this, or Ed and you would genuinely present as a man with significant cognitive decline. You would be forgetful, unsteady, easily confused. She closed the folder. Someone has been engineering that outcome very deliberately. I thought about Melissa refilling her wine glass at dinner. I thought about Ryan cutting his chicken without looking up. I thought about the way Melissa's hand had felt on mine, cool, dry, precisely warm enough to seem affectionate. "Patricia," I said, "what are you required to do now?" She did not hesitate. She had clearly already made this decision before I arrived. "California. Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15,630, requires mandated reporters, which includes physicians, to report known or suspected abuse of an elder to Adult Protective Services within 2 working days of observing or receiving information about it." She met my eyes directly. "I'm filing a report with APS this afternoon, Ed. I don't have a choice in that, and I wouldn't make a different one if I did." "I know," I said. "I told you do what the law requires. I was counting on it." Something shifted in her expression. The clinical precision gave way briefly to something that looked like it hurt. "Ed, how long have you known something was wrong?" "Since April," I said. "Maybe earlier if I am honest about when I started noticing things I wasn't ready to name." Patricia pressed her lips together and looked at the folder on her desk. Her fingers were very tight around her pen. "Who is doing this to you?" I told her. Not everything, not the full architecture of what I suspected, not the conversations I had replayed in my mind at 2 a.m, not the particular coldness of realizing that the person orchestrating this was someone who called me by my first name and cooked dinner in my kitchen, but enough. Enough for Patricia Walsh to sit back in her chair with an expression of such concentrated, controlled anger that for a moment she looked like a completely different person. "All right," she said quietly. "A PS will investigate. They'll coordinate with LAPD. There's an elder abuse unit and cases like this go to them. But Ed," she leaned forward, "you need a lawyer, today, not next week, today." I was already reaching for my phone. Frank Calloway had been my attorney for 30 years, and my friend for longer than that. We had met in 1993 at a clock auction in Pasadena. He had been bidding on a 19th century Austrian bracket clock that I had wanted badly, and he had outbid me, and afterward he had come over and introduced himself and said with a grin that I would come to recognize as his standard operating expression, "Sorry about the clock, can I buy you a beer instead?" He had the clock on his office wall to this day. I had never entirely forgiven him for it, which was the foundation of a very solid friendship. His office was on the 18th floor of a building on South Flower Street in downtown Los Angeles, with a view of the financial district that he claimed not to care about, and very clearly did. When I called him from the parking lot of Patricia's practice, he picked up on the second ring. "Ed," he said, "this is either about the Dodgers or something serious." "Something serious," I said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Frank Calloway did not do things with 4 seconds of silence unless he was giving a situation the full weight it deserved. "Talk to me," he said. I talked. I sat in my car in the parking lot on Duarte Road, with the California sun coming through the windshield and the air conditioning running, and told Frank Calloway everything, the pills, the tea, the questions about insurance and bank accounts, and the value of the clocks, the careful performance of concern that Ryan and Melissa had been staging in my living room for 2 months. When I finished, my throat was tight in a way I had not expected, a physical ache that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than words. Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very controlled, and beneath the control was something that sounded a great deal like fury. "Okay," he said, "here's what happens now. I'm going to contact APS this afternoon before they contact you, so we get ahead of this. I also know someone at LAPD's Elder Abuse Unit, Detective Carla Reyes. She's handled cases like this before, and she is exactly the kind of person you want on your side." He paused. "But Ed and I need you to hear this clearly. we cannot move too fast. If we act now with what we have, they lawyer up, they destroy evidence, and we get them on a misdemeanor at best. We need them to go further. We need them to take the last step themselves. The 911 call, I said. Exactly. Frank's voice was steady and certain, the voice of a man who has navigated difficult terrain before and knows where the solid ground is. When they make that call, there is no walking it back. That is the moment we have everything we need. Another pause. Can you go back in there and act like nothing has changed? I looked through the windshield at the ordinary beige building, with its watercolor poppies and its parking lot baking in the May sun, and I thought about Margaret, who had always said I was the most stubborn man she had ever loved, and who had meant it as a compliment. Frank, I said, I have been acting like nothing has changed for 2 months. I think I can manage a little longer. He exhaled a long, slow breath that carried the weight of everything we had just agreed to. All right, he said. Then we wait. But, Ed, you call me every week, and you be careful. I'm always careful, I said. I know, he said. That's the only reason I'm not more scared right now. I drove home the long way through the back streets of Arcadia and into Pasadena, past the pepper trees and the old craftsman houses and the wide, unhurried boulevards of a city that had been there long before any of this and would be there long after. When I pulled into the driveway on Oak Hollow Lane, Melissa's car was in its usual spot, and the kitchen light was on, and through the window I could see her moving around the kitchen, preparing dinner with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. I sat in the car for a moment, my hands on the steering wheel, and let myself feel fully, and without managing it, the grief and the fury and the particular exhaustion of a man who has just confirmed that the worst thing he suspected is true. Then, I got out of the car, walked through the front door, hung my keys on the hook where they always went, and called out, "Something smells good. What are we having?" Melissa smiled at me from the kitchen doorway, warm and bright and exactly as she always was. "Your favorite," she said, "pot roast." "Wonderful," I said, and smiled back at her, and meant absolutely none of it. The 2 months between May and July were the longest of my life, and I have lived through some considerable stretches of time that did not want to pass. I want to be clear about what those months required of me, because I think people sometimes imagine that pretending is easy, that if you know the truth, the performance becomes simple, a matter of just saying the opposite of what you feel. That is not how it works. Pretending done properly is exhausting in a way that goes all the way down to the bone. It means smiling when your chest is full of something cold and heavy. It means saying, "Thank you, that smells wonderful," when someone sets a bowl of soup in front of you that you have no intention of touching. It means watching every single day the person who is dismantling your life from the inside and giving them absolutely nothing to work with. I became very good at it. The medication was the most delicate part. I had kept a small backup supply of my actual blood pressure pills in the workshop, safe from the moment I first noticed the substitution. Each morning, I performed the same ritual, picking up the counterfeit pill, appearing to swallow it with my coffee, then disposing of it in the workshop later. But I also understood that Melissa was watching for results. If I remained visibly sharp and alert, she would suspect. So I began performing a gradual, careful decline, slightly slower responses in the afternoon, occasional pauses before answering simple questions, a tendency to repeat myself that I calibrated precisely enough to seem organic rather than theatrical. I was in the end a better actor than any of them had credited me for being. Melissa continued her questions about the accounts, about the insurance, about what I intended to do with the workshop, eventually. I continued my answers